Montano, Part 3, mid-March 2281. Montano sat in the longhouse and primary domicile of himself and his newest veteran Decanus, Dead Sea. Montano had been particularly proud of the rather unknown officer and admired his leadership during the taking of the town enough to keep him as the acting head of the garrison at Nelson. The centurion thought back to the night they took the town almost 2 months back and how easy of a win that was. Montano truly hoped that Lord Caesar would have approved the order to take the town back when he first sent the action request in late September of 2280. But that was irrelevant given the ultimate victory and the new pressure they were able to put on the NCR. As Montano thought, part of him still wished the taking of Nelson was more immediate, as the nearly 4 months of waiting only allowed for the NCR to finalize its negotiation for Nelson's absorption into the NCR. With that came a whole company of NCR soldiers taking up residence in the town, and the time between NCR's fortification at Nelson also allowed them to fortify a new position north of the town. This position north of Nelson had become a profligate camp called Camp Hope, and was currently acting as the profligates' new front line since the fall of Nelson. Although it has come to Montano's attention that the NCR camp is now being called Camp Forlorn Hope, and this desperate name was all thanks to himself and Dead Sea, the unofficial commander of Nelson's garrison. So, as unfortunate as it was for NCR to have troops in the town proper, the presence of profligate forces only created even more worthiness for Dead Sea's raised veteran. Contrary to that notion, Montano thought again how the town fell almost without resistance, despite a whole platoon of NCR forces watching over the town that night. Dead Sea led the town to its doom, as if there was nobody watching over the place at all. This meager resistance and rapid conquest of an NCR-occupied township only solidified the weakness of NCR soldiers into the minds of Legion soldiers even more. And so, after the example was made that next morning, Montano had Dead Sea carry out the town's destruction in the way Dead Sea saw fit. And Montano saw his own reflection in the man as his legionaries forced the town's residents off the cliffs into the Colorado. Fully within sight of the surviving NCR forces at their meager outpost north of town, the battered profligates could only watch as the people they thought they were protecting got killed mercilessly for their NCR allegiance. Since that night, Nelson had become the Legion's own newest front. The rest of the Terror forces would continue to operate in and around Cottonwood Cove, keeping pressure on Searchlight and the ranger stations, while also destroying NCR supply trains and reinforcements across the southern Mojave. At the same time, Montano was ordered to hold Nelson, having Dead Sea remain the acting commander, while Montano himself saw to the expansion of the Terror's raiding operations into new areas across the south. Although the town of Novak stood several miles west and was bolstered by an NCR garrison at a sun power station called Helios 1, the highway's access through the new outpost at Nelson saw to even more raiding opportunities. Whoever survived the roads around Searchlight found themselves becoming victims of new Legion raids around the Novak territory, all thanks to the new Legion position at Nelson. Yes, the taking of Nelson was an enormous opportunity for the Legion, but it eventually became very clear that between the enemy just north of their position and the other ranger stations in the Novak-Nelson region that holding this position was the highest priority. Luckily for Montano, it wasn't only the natural mountains and cliff fortifications around the Nelson region that helped him keep the town. It was also thanks to Lord Caesar himself, who saw the taking of Nelson as yet another means of crushing the NCR's morale into a bloody pulp. Montano considered taking Forlorn Hope the day following his successful assault on Nelson, but his approval to launch the initial attack came with the additional order to hold his ground. As pathetic as the profligate forces around Forlorn Hope were in the immediate aftermath, the position was a really good one. And even taking that meager force would come with its own superfluous casualties that would leave Nelson almost completely open to a few highly skilled ranger teams from a nearby ranger station. No, that had to wait. And as soon as Caesar's reinforcements arrived at Nelson, so did the NCR's. Montano watched as another century joined his own in the town's center before his attention was immediately turned to the north. There, beyond the little paths he watched Nelson's protectors flee through a few nights prior, Montano saw the profligate reinforcements trickle out of an opening in the western valley. Into the wide wash separating Nelson and Hope, then up the steep winding dirt path up to the NCR's new position atop the northern cliffs. As Camp Forlorn Hope became more and more populated by NCR reinforcements, Montano called off all raid plans to try to hold the town if necessary. It wasn't much later that Montano and the forces occupying Nelson received intel from Frumentari agents in the NCR army that current orders for all soldiers coming to Camp Hope were to hold the place at all costs. Upon learning that NCR was on the defensive from their new position, Lord Kaisar knew he had to keep it that way, and so Montano received his new orders. Montano/Dead Sea were to hold Nelson and continue the campaign of raiding and terror in the new region, while Lord Kaisar sought to make some use of the countless new soldiers he brought from the east. Less than a week after Nelson fell, the place became a staging ground for Legion forces to keep the pressure on Camp Forlorn Hope, while Montano continued the raid campaign. This was a most agreeable situation at first, but over the weeks since, Montano had seen many centuries of the Legion take lodging at Nelson only to disappear in their subsequent assault on the NCR lines at Forlorn Hope. Montano had watched this diminishment of Legion forces, and although he wasn't worried about the loss of manpower, he was slightly troubled by their inability to seize any true victories. He held nothing but admiration for all those who completed their goal of dying for Kaisar in the chaos of battle, but aside from the message about Legion resolve, Montano continued to feel troubled by the lack of experience obtained by these waves of cannon fodder. Even when Montano employed similar tactics for recruits amongst the terror forces, there had usually been at least some survivors and some successes that gave these newer soldiers the experience needed. At last, nearly 2 months had passed since the fall of Nelson, and Montano had his Colorado Raiders, his veterans, his entire force either expertly suppressing the western highways or holding the town. Spending most of his days roaming the grounds of Nelson, Montano considered how his role in the terror was diminishing. It wasn't his role as a commander that he felt was diminishing. It was mostly his role as a blood-covered servant of Kaisar that he felt was diminishing. As of late, Montano more and more felt that he was ever so subtly becoming the kind of commander that he used to mock his rival for. Sure, Montano was present on countless raids since moving to the southern Mojave, but he had scarcely taken on any other role than commander at the rear in almost 7 months. Since leading the probing assault on Camp Searchlight and acting as observer during the taking of Nelson, Montano's time in actual battle had been almost non-existent. All the while, he'd been watching century after century storm the line of guns atop Forlorn Hope, watching their glorious demise and receiving word of victory after victory in his force's raiding work across the region. At this time, and after so little part in the continuing wave of pressure and victories, the NCR position at Camp Forlorn Hope sat mocking him less than 2 miles from his residence in Nelson. So, as Montano sat in the primary longhouse in the center of Nelson, he continued to think about what he wanted to do until the entryway finally opened. Montano lifted his eyes from the little footlocker beneath his legs and watched Dead Sea enter accompanied by Falco with the rest of the staff, as well as Centurion Tubero with his officers. The new arrivals hailed Centurion Montano, and he did likewise as he gestured for all of them to take their seats in the little circle between the stacked bunks. When all were situated, Centurion Tubero asked Montano, "Centurion Montano, might I request the reason for your summons?" Everyone else remained silent as Montano replied instantly, "I only asked you for an audience so that I may inquire about your standing directive and the strength of those forces under your charge." Centurion Tubero wasn't really used to giving such information to a centurion who wasn't technically part of his cohort, but Tubero knew who Montano was and knew of his veterancy, so Tubero answered, "I am under the standing directive to lead my century of recruits and primes into the profligates' front line tomorrow evening, in hopes that the death of myself and my men will leave a lasting impact on the diminishing resolve of the profligates." Montano let the response hang for a brief moment until he said out loud to himself, "Not planning for any sort of battlefield victory?" The silence lingered while Montano studied Centurion Tubero for a while longer. Montano hadn't ever heard of Centurion Tubero, not in the meat grinder, not in the Auxilia campaigns, and not even at the dam. Montano saw the lack of scars on Tubero's face and limbs, and though there were indeed a few, there weren't enough to show just how experienced this commander of a recruit century full of cannon fodder may have actually been. The duelist was about to ask the commander about his record of battlefield experience, or which fronts created his position of leadership, when he figured he could learn all he needed to by asking Centurion Tubero plainly. "Might I ask you what you plan on wearing into battle tomorrow night, Centurion Tubero?" There was a brief pause as neither the Centurion or anyone else in Tubero's staff knew what that question even meant. After a moment, Tubero gestured to his pristine and polished Centurion garb and armor, dotted with trinkets and trophies from primitive conquests. As Tubero did this, and raised his finger to the shining helmet with that wide plume of red, he said to Montano, "I intend to lead my forces into battle adorned in all the accoutrements indicative of my station." Another silence ensued after that, as an amused grin crept across Montano's face. Although the faces of Dead Sea, Falco, and the soldiers who'd been in the terror were covered, Montano felt their own amusement at the new Centurion's words, while Tubero and his staff remained silent. Montano finally said, "Centurion Tubero here has clearly not battled the profligates of NCR for long." Before Tubero could inquire about Montano's words, Montano added plainly, "Change your apparel, Centurion Tubero. You are to dress as I am dressed for your battle tomorrow night." Montano motioned over himself as Centurion Tubero looked over the veteran commander. Tubero had been wondering why Montano was wearing the armor of a lowly prime legionary Decanus since he stepped into the room, but the order from Montano made Tubero inquire simply, "My Primus, I shall do as you suggest, but must inquire as to the reason for a demotion of my battle dress?" The grin on Montano's face grew only a bit wider as he said to the officer, "You must not have been at the dam, Centurion Tubero." When this didn't satisfy Tubero's inquiry, Montano explained, "The enemy to the north inhabits a supremely dug-in position. Atop the cliff and punctuating the flanks of their line of disorganized conscripts lay observation towers. These towers are inhabited by teams of ranger snipers who excel at what they do." Again, this did not seem to answer Tubero's question. Montano saw this and concluded for his ignorant colleague, "If you march into battle wearing the armor befitting a centurion of the Legion, you'll be killed before you can order the charge, let alone make it across the shrub valley or no man's land." Centurion Tubero sat there and considered this for a moment. Finally, the new commander took these words of advice for what they were when they came from an officer as experienced as Montano. The pause and contemplation ended when Tubero replied, "Your advice is most appreciated, my Primus, and I shall do as you require before tomorrow evening." Then another question came to him, and he added, "But how shall my soldiers identify me in the heat of battle?" Montano could tell how inexperienced this commander was, especially since he required an answer to the new question. "Your command voice will act as its own indication of your title when it's heard by the legionaries of your century." Montano didn't think he'd need to answer that question since every centurion knew how in tune their men were to the commands issued by voice alone. Not understanding why a centurion needed to remove his visual identifiers on this front was one thing, but not knowing the power of your own voice as a centurion was another. Montano took one more long look at the new commander and pieced together an assumed backstory for him. Centurion Tubero was placed as the garrison commander of a small town like Shiprock or Gallup for a long time after serving adequately enough to make veteran Decanus or junior centurion sometime after a long service in, perhaps the New Mexico campaign. It had probably been years, maybe even a decade since the centurion led forces in battle, spending most of his service to Caesar overseeing some small township or running administrative work for someone like a regional praetor. It wasn't until the town he oversaw was selected for absorption that Centurion Tubero was removed from his position. Handed control of a century made of mostly recruits and less experienced primes, the Caesar rounded him up to bolster the Mojave front. Though an officer like Tubero still held all the dedication of an officer befitting the rank, and though he was still more than willing to die in an assault on the profligates at Forlorn Hope, the brief interaction showed Montano that all that command ability was more than a little bit dusty. No wonder all these centuries marched straight into the slaughter, thought Montano, as he recalled the many centuries that passed through Nelson in recent weeks. Each one of those commanders Caesar brought from the east were sent through Nelson to see their long overdue deaths after their old roles were rendered obsolete by the new nature of this front. As glorious as death for Caesar was on the field of battle, and as much of a victory as that was in its own way, Montano knew right there that something more tangible could come from an assault on forlorn hope if only the commander was a little more experienced. Montano had battled this idea in his head for some weeks now, but this short meeting with Centurion Tubero was the only sign Montano needed that it was time to act. At last, the silence had gone on long enough, and Montano met the eyes of Tubero one more time as he said, "Given your inexperience battling the kind of enemy we face on this front, I'll ask that I personally join your assault on Forlorn Hope tomorrow night." Again, there was a brief pause after that. Dead Sea remained statue-like, his mind's contents indecipherable, while Montano felt the unease in Falco's still position. Montano knew that Falco was unnerved by Montano's plans, having been acquainted with them by time at his Centurion's side. Still, Falco had no idea that Montano would finally act on those ideas until he heard them spoken to Centurion Tubero. Montano felt all of these misgivings from his second, but ignored them as he studied the face of Centurion Tubero. Finally, Centurion Tubero said, "It would be above my position to decline the opportunity requested by a Centurion of such high renown. I would happily accept Centurion Montano's aid in my assault on Forlorn Hope, provided the role does not interfere with his current directives." "My oversight tomorrow night would do no such thing," said Montano immediately. "Then it is agreed. I will be honored to slaughter the profligates by your side, Centurion Montano." Montano and Centurion Tubero stood and saluted one another. The agreement was set, while Montano felt an increasing discomfort emanate from the sitting statue of Decanus Falco. After that, Montano ran over a few things with Tubero, outlining the layout of the NCR position, what to expect, when to advance, etc. But with the addition of a few other details Montano had in mind for the day that he lead Forlorn Hope's fall. When the short briefing was done, Centurion Tubero departed, taking his staff with him, and Montano turned to his own staff officers saying how he's leaving the rest of the century in Nelson under the command of Dead Sea. Tomorrow evening, Montano would be taking only his staff along for Tubero's assault tomorrow, and when the short little update to the staff was relayed, he dismissed them to carry out their last directives of the evening. As the staff departed, Montano could feel the uneasiness in Falco begin to fade when he saw Falco still hesitate in his departure. Just as Falco was about to exit through the longhouse entryway, Montano said flatly, "Decanus Falco, halt." Falco halted and turned around to face his Centurion. When Falco had turned, Montano wordlessly gestured for Falco to take his seat again and looked at Dead Sea who stood by in the room. Montano softly ordered Dead Sea to depart as well, and the new veteran Decanus immediately did so as Falco sat himself back in his spot. When Dead Sea was gone, the door shut, and Montano poured a bottle of water into his canteen as he said to his staff senior, "Speak what's troubling you, Decanus Falco." Falco hesitated, not out of fear, but out of not being ordered to speak his inner troubles before. Montano raised an eyebrow at this hesitation and finished screwing on the cap of his canteen as he moved to take his seat again. As soon as his Centurion began to move towards his seat, Falco said, "Forgive me if I am mistaken, Centurion Montano, but I thought Lord Caesar's directives for the century were to hold Nelson." Montano stayed silent till he was back in his chair. Then he met the eyes of Falco and answered, "That is the order for Dead Sea, the official commander of the garrison at Nelson." Falco was ready to accept the answer right there, but unfortunately for him, the doubt in his being began to emanate before his words could accept it. Montano felt this misgiving and knew that Falco's agreement would be a lie, so Montano permitted Falco to speak again with what was truly on his mind. "But what is to come of your force's obligations to continue the terror from this position at Nelson? Should something happen to my Centurion?" Montano looked at the unconsciously worried face of Falco and grew another slight smile. This smile came from pride in the man he adopted into his staff so long ago. Montano knew that the only worry in Falco's being came from the possibility of not adhering to Caesar's orders. At last, Montano asked his second, "Decanus Falco, can you elaborate for me my orders from Caesar?" "Automatically," Falco said. "My Centurion is under the standing directive to support the garrison at Nelson and continue raids in the territory west of the Nelson regional limits." Montano only said, "Wrong," the word causing Falco's face to contort in confusion until Montano clarified, "I asked for my orders from Caesar, not my orders pertaining to this front." Falco thought back to his years growing up in a boys' camp outside Circle Junction. He'd known the answer to this supreme question since he first gained consciousness after growing up in such a place. Falco began to wonder why this supreme duty had evaded his memory for even a second when he unconsciously began to say, "Your orders from Lord Caesar are to serve him with all your being till your dying breath, to advance the Legion in every way you can, to die in glory on the field of battle, and offer your own life without hesitation when the opportunity to bring glory to Caesar presents itself." "Exactly," said Montano, his grin vanishing from his face and being replaced by his usual sinister countenance. Centurion Montano spoke to Falco as calmly and cordially as ever, putting any misgivings in Falco's mind to rest. "The Legion will hold Nelson should I fall. A new commander will take my place and continue the raids should I fall. Lord Caesar shall march across the dam should I fall. But at this moment, I am to do what I can to ensure more glory comes to our emperor, and if my part in Centurion Tubero's attack allows victory up north at the expense of my death, then Lord Caesar will be pleased, and so shall I." Falco accepted this answer after a long moment. His centurion was right, and there was not much else to say, but there was plenty to do. Falco, just like every other soldier of Caesar, was ready for his death in battle. Given the already superfluous legionaries to fall in attacks on forlorn hope since Nelson was taken, Falco knew this ambition of his commander was one he was very unlikely to come back from. Although the idea of certain death did little to unnerve Falco, the uncomfortable feeling remained after he departed his centurion's presence, and he had no idea why. One way or another, the Legion would win the following night, whether or not he lived to see it. Falco settled his mind with thoughts of inevitable victory. But why that subconscious feeling of dread remained was an ongoing mystery. As nearly impossible as it was to fail in a Legion assault, neither Falco nor his commander were able to even consider what an actual failure to Caesar would look like. The next night, Montano never felt it during all those charges into the slaughter he'd been present for. He continued to wonder why his ability to hear almost disappeared after the order to charge was screamed over the roar of guns. Whether that order was issued by himself, the centurions up the line, or by an elite or legate on the field of battle, the experience was always the same. After the order, Montano no longer heard the thunderous sound of soldiers storming across the sand. He no longer heard the war drums beating in the rear, the gunshots, the screams of the enemy, or the frenzied shouts of his own men. He'd only hear all of that in some distant otherworldly place. The crack of rifles, the explosions, and all that sound after the charge as if it were happening miles away. Montano would also find himself wondering why the landscape seemed to simply roll past him, why he never felt his legs propelling him forward, how he maneuvered over bomb craters, pushed past his perforated men, or even felt the whiz of bullets skimming past him. Just as he'd thought 1,000 times before, the trance of this opening battlefield chaos always came to a screeching halt when he had finally arrived in the thick of it. Montano's world came completely back in a flash as he found himself on top of a terrified enemy of Caesar. Underneath the moonlight and the blinding star shells bursting overhead, Montano saw every detail on the face below him. He saw the eyes beneath that ragged brown trooper helmet frantically darting every direction in search of a means to save himself, or more likely, in search of someone he loved. Perhaps looking for his mother or father to help him, the enemy of Caesar would desperately search for some kind of comfort or savior when faced with his death at the hands of a crimson beast who was born in savage tribal warfare. Montano saw the nick on the trooper's face he got earlier that morning when he shaved, seeing the man's mouth hung open and screaming inaudibly over the burst of machine gun fire. Centurion Montano saw all this in his victim's face in the milliseconds after the tackle, and the savage servant of Caesar relished in the feeling of that trooper's hands attempting to force him off. The effort was futile, and Montano's only wish in that moment was that he wasn't wearing the helmet of a prime and the accompanying face covering so that the trooper could see the smile on his killer's face. Montano felt the trooper's frantic grip encircle his neck, but not even that could stop the blade that Montano finally slit up the trooper's jaw. As much as Montano loved watching the life leave the eyes of Caesar's enemies, there was no time as his pleasure was interrupted by a series of loud explosions behind him. Montano rose and searched for a new victim. The centurion stood in an instant, just in time to see the bulk of the force under Centurion Tubero smash into the profligate line. As he scrambled to orient himself in the new chaos, he briefly saw the 4 members of his staff, each battling their own NCR soldier amidst the dirt trench before his attention diverted to the source of the explosions. Just to his rear, he saw the last of Tubero's surviving force storm through the dust cloud and hurtle over the barbed wire. The rest of the assaulting force threw themselves into the trench, and Montano had seen the fire just beyond the dust cloud. Montano had heard the explosions of the grenadiers atop Forlorn Hope's observation line on countless nights patrolling the grounds of Nelson. But this night must have been a special occasion, since the bright illumination beyond the dust cloud showed that they had launched a volley of incendiary grenades. In the brief moment, Montano saw the fires across the no man's land rise, incinerating the shrub valley they stormed across seconds earlier. As the clash of steel and burst of rifles pierced his eardrums, Montano saw that fire blocking off the way they came, and the idea that this battle was victory or death gave Montano a feeling of euphoria he hadn't experienced in all his years across so many fronts. Another series of star shells or flares popped overhead, and Montano's attention was turned to the dark silhouettes atop the cliff marking the profligate's rear or observation line. Hearing the chaos around him continue, his attention was finally turned to the start of the long winding path up the cliff. Around 50 yards past the current battle zone in the trench line, Montano could only think one step at a time as he returned to the current battle. Seconds turned into minutes as the Legion continued their butcher's work on the soldiers in the trench. One by one, Montano found new victims in the brutal trench fight. More explosions rocked the area and more guns burst from the cliffs above, while the dust of battlefield chaos blanketed the region more and more as the NCR bodies continued to collapse into the trench. Montano was so entranced in this battle, and the fight was so chaotic that Montano scarcely even felt it when the heat of that fire in the no man's land was burning hot enough to reach him. In fact, the heat was only a reminder that there was no aid or reinforcements coming, and certainly no retreat, even if he didn't know what that word meant. At thought of this, Montano heard the battle all around and realized his final end was likely here and now. That was, of course, if the Legion wasn't winning. Montano had been so lost in the moment of battle and so caught in the moment of each profligate he killed that he hadn't noticed the progress of Tubero's force in minutes, seconds, hours perhaps. It was very difficult to keep track of time in the chaos of battle, and progress was hard to keep tabs on when each killed profligate or Legion soldier looked just like the last when obscured by so much chaotic dust. The only time Montano panicked in perhaps his whole life was when he had just killed his 6th Californian and noticed the sound around him, or increasing lack thereof. The trench was completely filled with the bodies of dead profligates as well as legionaries, and the dust was still too thick around him to make out a lot of the chaos, but the sound still sent its own message. In a single moment, Montano noticed that the gunshots atop the cliff were becoming less and less frequent, and the clash of steel or screams of battle were even more distant and infrequent. Just then, the dust had cleared, and although his first intention was to look around and see who was alive, his focus landed completely on another profligate soldier who almost ran into him. Montano stared at the trembling trooper pointing a rifle and bayonet at him, and although Montano admired the trooper's face showing extremely forced aggression, he would kill this trooper without any problem. However, just as Montano stepped toward the trooper and adjusted the grip on his blood-soaked blade, he stopped again. The sound of chaos was even less now, with the only sound being a few distant struggles somewhere across the line. The guns atop the cliff were dead silent now, and although a few shots popped off here and there, Montano realized he could now hear the groaning of the injured and maimed. This silence gave Montano the most horrible panic he'd ever felt, and unable to shift his focus from the trooper before him, the realization of what this dying chaos meant made him look at the trooper in a new way. Montano saw the face past that wobbling bayonet and knew what he had to do. He stepped toward the trooper, but the trooper only backed up. He saw the trooper's teeth clenched in anger and forced bravery, and the dry tears and blood smeared on his face said that he was still willing to fight to the death if he had to. Although Montano knew that this final victim really wished he didn't have to. Another step forward, and the trooper hadn't shot him. Another step, and that bayonet continued to wobble. One more step, and Montano screamed, "I killed your friends. Kill me already, you fucking coward." The trooper continued to back up and Montano spat at the man, figuring he'd kill this last trooper and storm the profligate camp proper if this coward couldn't give him the death he wanted. The distant chaos died even more before he heard some distant frenzy somewhere along the trench, but still, Montano approached. Finally, Montano sought to fulfill his new plan, which was triggered when the trooper's bayonet touched his breastplate. In an instant, the trooper at last mustered the courage to do what needed to be done and brought his bayoneted rifle back, ready to plunge it into the legionary. The only problem was that the trooper was too slow. The trooper thrusted the bayonet at Montano in one heavy motion, and the duelist immediately ripped the rifle from the trooper's hands before the point could land. Like lightning, Montano disarmed the trooper and threw the rifle aside as he raised his blade. In less than a millisecond, Montano raised his blade to swing at the now cowering trooper. But as soon as he went to finish the deed, he found that he couldn't. All his strength couldn't bring the blade down, and Montano was once again so lost in the moment that he didn't even feel the grip on his arm. Reality came crashing down, and he immediately felt the hands on his person when he heard the voices from behind him. "We got one!" and "Hold him down." Montano immediately went into his own frenzy, as he was all but completely blinded by everything and everyone who appeared around him. His mind went from death in battle to death, 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 in that single instant as he tried with all his might to bring his blade to his neck. Montano was incredibly strong, but he tried with everything he had to move that blade for one final slash of supreme servitude to Lord Caesar. But more and more hands were placed upon him until he finally felt the blade get pried out of his hands and found himself completely encircled by soldiers in brown. He'd lost his blade, but still he fought as he was essentially drowned by the soldiers of California. Everything he had, physically, mentally, and spiritually, was rapidly draining as he struggled and struggled in the grip of what felt like 20 men, cussing and screaming the whole time until eventually he was brought to the ground. He caught one look at the dark sky, noticed the illumination of the ignited no man's land, and thought he saw the faintest light of dawn in the east before his vision was obstructed by a half-dozen profligate soldiers. Those soldiers appeared to pile on top of him, and still he struggled in their grip until he was twisted onto his stomach. Still cussing and shouting under the weight of so many profligates, Montano screamed, "Kill me!" again and again, begging for one of these profligates to give him the mercy of death he so desperately needed. No use. Montano felt his hands get twisted behind his back and heard the clank of shackles as he continued to scream and shout. Then, somewhere beyond the grunts and curses from the California soldiers around him, he heard a familiar voice pierce through the winds. "Sire! Sire! I failed!" Montano continued to give everything he had beneath the weight of so many men and despite his completely bound state, but the voice entered Montano's mind and he found himself shouting into the sand. "Falco!" Before Montano could say anything else, his helmet was ripped off his head and a rifle butt to the cranium rendered him unconscious. Montano awoke 2 or 3 hours later. The sun was just peeking over the east, and Montano awoke to find himself surrounded by dozens of profligate soldiers and under the treatment of a doctor. It took Montano a second to realize where he was, and not even his survey of his surroundings seemed to cement reality. Montano looked around and saw the long lines of profligate soldiers lying on stretchers as he found himself sitting next to a small pool in what appeared to be a town made of scrap metal shacks and army tents. Montano saw the patrols of dirt-covered profligate soldiers in their brown uniforms and pan helmets pass him by hurling the odd insult, and watched more NCR troops come up the trailhead, carting more stretchers occupied by wounded or killed troopers. Just to his left, and beyond the line of killed or injured soldiers, was a scrap fortified barricade dotted with over 40 helmeted heads, all either watching him or looking south. Montano looked past the observation line, not interested in it from this angle, and saw the distant line of crosses dotting the cliffs around Nelson. The smoke of the night's battle continued to rise from the grounds below the observation line, and his attention turned to the nearby towers where he found himself in the sights of 4 high-caliber rifles, all held by soldiers in dusters and dark gas helmets. Still unable to believe where he was, Montano turned to the right, seeing more stretchers before his eyes went to the flagpole in front of that large tent marked HQ. Under the illumination of dawn, Montano saw the flag of the 2-headed bear flapping gently in the wind. The sight of that flag, and the realization that he was in the middle of the profligate encampment would have made him vomit right there. But his reflex to do so was sidetracked when he felt the prick of a needle in his left arm. At last, Montano turned to the profligate medic who was working on him and watched the syringe pump its serum into his arm as he heard the Californian say subtly, "You're lucky we're treating you at all, Legion scum. Wasting a fucking stim on you is too kind for my say-so if you ask." Montano immediately threw his head into the medic's face, knocking him over. As soon as he shuffled his chained hands under his legs and pounced on the recovering medic, Montano instantly felt more hands appear from behind and take him to the ground. Once again, Montano struggled in the grip of several troopers screaming, "I said kill me, fucking heal me with drugs? Fuck you." Montano felt a rag or scarf get put in his mouth and his fight was rapidly diminished under the pressure of those soldiers. As Montano's struggle lessened and lessened, he heard a new struggle commence somewhere off to his right. A couple troopers left Montano to aid in that new struggle, but he was still completely pinned by the 3 remaining troopers. Montano could do nothing but listen as he stayed pinned to that stretcher, and there he remembered Falco, who he heard continue to struggle as his own struggle died more and more. After several moments, he heard Falco's struggle get silenced, and a few minutes passed before one of the troopers with a sergeant insignia on his helmet hovering over him looked up from Montano and shouted to someone just beyond Montano's vision, "Yeah, what's up, Samson?" Montano only heard the trooper called Samson say, "Staff Sergeant says to keep these 2 together and wait till Palatli tells us what to do with them." The trooper turned from Samson back to Montano and said, "All right, big fella, get your ass up." The nameless trooper and his 2 unnamed comrades lifted Montano up, the movement allowing Montano to resume his struggle once more, only for it to be swiftly ended by a few rifle stocks to his ribs and back. Montano had to be beaten so much during this short movement to Falco that he had to be dragged most of the way. By the time he was thrown on the stretcher beside Falco, he was too disoriented to even consider how it should have been Falco that was brought to him. As he spat out some blood and studied the equally battered Falco on the next stretcher, Montano remembered how his rank and title was still unknown. Looking over Falco's exposed and bruised arms and face, he saw that Falco's armor had been stripped, and the thumping pain on his own body explained why those rifle stocks hurt so much. After another moment, Montano and his second met eyes and gave nods to one another as they came to the same conclusion. Get ourselves killed. Both Montano and Falco then began to stand themselves up before the 6 soldiers around them immediately knocked them to the ground once more. One of the faces hovering over Falco raised to the words of an onlooking trooper, "Corporal Adams, go get some chow. Me and the boys will watch them. I got an itchy trigger finger. One move and the boys and I will blast them." "Yes," thought Montano and Falco at the same time before the trooper over Falco, Corporal Adams, replied, "That's what these fuckers want, Private. Get out of that pool and make your rounds." "Shit," thought Montano and Falco at the same time, the words causing a new wave in defiance to get themselves killed. Still, their efforts were suppressed with minimal effort from their outnumbered surroundings and bound states. More minutes passed, and Falco and Montano continued to struggle when they had the energy, while their curses and shouts were still muffled by the gags in their mouths. A short time later, the 2 heard a rapid series of footsteps get closer and closer and then halt. Then, the trooper with a sergeant insignia apparently called Hansley looked up to some distant messenger who started with, "Sergeant Hansley, Major says to throw these 2 in the jail shack until he finishes up comms with McCarran. They got 2 of the fellas from Charlie Company waiting for them now." Falco and Montano were stood up, and their immediate protests were delayed by a few preemptive rifle butts to the legs and ribs. Montano could hardly see the camp as he was dragged along, his vision too blurred by dust in his eyes and agony from those blows. The pain of war used to make Montano and soldiers like Falco only more excited for the next chance to spill blood, but this pain was different. The physical nature of this pain seemed only to further amplify itself in the humiliation they felt at the memory of being captured, being bound, dragged, beaten, and not even having the ability to verbally protest left the 2 men feeling completely neutered. All Montano and all Falco could do was think. Thinking about their capture was too much. Their minds were still almost entirely focused on how to best get themselves killed, but knowing each of their protests would only get them further subdued rather than killed. They could only think and plot. Montano, in particular, took his dragging to the Forlorn Hope jail as yet another opportunity to solidify his disdain for the enemy as his vision returned, and he heard the world around him. The nature of these profligate soldiers was abominable, Montano thought, as he saw the soldiers in their dirtied and half-stripped uniforms carrying their weapons in lackadaisical manners and talking to one another in broken English full of slang and idiocy. Even the simple way these soldiers talked made the common recruit appear to be a scholar in comparison to their profligate counterparts. One such incident stuck out to Montano as he heard a distant profligate shout to one of his escorts. "Hey, Sarn, I hear Harton's in the jail shack. Let him know he still owes me a half-pack when you see him." "Bastard, don't even smoke." Brief little utterances like that disgusted Montano to his core, and Montano was half tempted to ask permission from his sergeant escort to pummel the distant inferior himself for addressing his commander or sergeant in such a casual fashion. More of his hatred was channeled to the forefront of his mind when he heard other remarks like that, or the additional one from the same man. "And tell Corporal Benson I'm still waiting for her. She's got my rack number. Ha ha." As much as the nature of this profligate military full of dissolute trash disgusted Montano, the most bewildering thing was that the sergeant's response was only a slight chuckle and the shaking of his head. No reprimand, no flogging, no execution, no nothing. The sergeant simply let the order from an inferior slide, and the gross insubordination was only met with actual amusement from the profligate decanus or squad leader. The only thing stopping Montano from instructing the sergeant how to deal with his ill-disciplined lot of garbage and lecturing him on his incorrect response to such insubordinate demands was the gag in his mouth. The only thing that particular encounter did was spark another wave of struggle for his three-man escort. The defiant struggle in Montano's heart only grew and grew as he recalled the wretch's words regarding a trooper woman in the camp. As his protest grew more and more vicious, his sporadic head movements caught the sight of almost every woman soldier in the camp. "How are there so many women in an army?" Montano's mind screamed, his internal dismay and physical protest sparking off another round of frenzying in Falco as well. This physical struggle was only tamed but not put out by the rifle stocks in his side, and yet another unforeseen relief came when he felt the gag get removed from his mouth as he heard a nearby trooper say, "We're here. In ya go." The sudden removal of his gag instantly unleashed a deafening flood of those shouts and curses that he'd only been able to think. Falco too joined in this verbal chaos as his own gag was removed, and both legionaries were shoved violently into the wall of the jail shack. Before their minds could catch up to what was happening, Montano and Falco found themselves inside the darkened jail shack and on one side of the metal bars. As soon as they came to, their shouts did not cease, even as they watched the last of their escorts file out of the building. The only thing their escort's departure did was turn their focus to the two jailers on the other side of the bars, where their insults and incoherent shouts turned from hatred of NCR at large to threats of rape to the female jailer was unknown even to them. But a legionary in captivity was no longer a person or servant of Caesar. A captured legionary was a violent, untamable animal that can't be satisfied by anything but its own death. Seconds turned into minutes, and the female jailer continued to pace back and forth on the other side of the bars, tapping the metal with a long baton and meeting every insult Falco and Montano threw her way. Montano took note of the other jailer, sitting in a chair against the wall with a rifle across his lap, and even though the distant smile and silence of that man infuriated Montano, he was more preoccupied with the taunting female. More time passed as Montano and Falco continued to endlessly scream and threaten the female, and their hands were already broken and horrendously bloody from smacking the bars with their bound hands. As well as the woman held her own at the start, Montano could see the woman struggle to formulate counters to their threats after Falco had mentioned her name they overheard. The woman continued to fume as their insults and threats to rape and mutilate her became more and more personal with each attachment of her name. "It's working," thought Montano and Falco, as the woman became less and less smug and eventually retreated to the desk. More and more horrific threats were hurled at her person, each one digging a little deeper when she saw the sincerity of these threats in the blood on their broken hands. They kept it up again and again. The woman had finally rested her hand next to the rifle leaning on the desk, and there she snapped. Just not in the way Montano and Falco wanted. "If I gotta be here 1 second longer, I'm gonna break the rules of war," shouted the woman trooper to her idiot comrade still grinning with a rifle across his lap. Defeat entered Montano's mind for the first time since waking up in captivity. The woman stormed out, but true to his ability to snatch victory in any battle, Montano would not accept this defeat for long. He and Falco's attention was turned to the silent fool wearing a grin. How that grin remained on that trooper's face wouldn't be answered until later, but its lingering presence did nothing but continue his screams as the bars of the jail shack became more and more bloody. Not long after the woman left, she was replaced by a male trooper identified as a sergeant, and after a brief exchange of words with the fool, Montano noted that the seated soldier wasn't a mute. Either way, the sergeant who entered was at least willing to partake in this verbal altercation. Perhaps this man could be broken too. Perhaps he can succeed where the woman failed, thought Montano and Falco. As much as the sergeant partook in the mudslinging, he felt it was a game he was winning based on the cleverness of his insults. Unfortunately for the sergeant, neither Montano or Falco even heard the sergeant's counters, while their own words did nothing but roll off the sergeant's back. Eventually, the sergeant was under the false impression that he had already won, and appeared to grow tired of the game that Montano and Falco were still playing. Not more than 5 minutes after the sergeant's arrival, he left, telling the silent moron that he was going to get a status update from some officer. Montano and Falco both watched the sergeant's departure and pleaded with him not to leave them in the presence of such an absent-minded idiot who likely wasn't able to kill them if that moronic grin said anything about his mental faculties. Of course, these pleads came in the form of incoherent noises as their voices were only able to spew vile slurs. At last, the two captured servants of Caesar watched the door shut, the sergeant seemingly taking the last possibility of a merciful killing with him. Defeat entered the minds of both men yet again, and even though the two of them were both equally lost by the sergeant's departure, Falco was the only one who was able to act on the implication of prolonged captivity. Falco threw himself into the corner of the cell, and despite his bloodied and broken hands, began to savagely punch himself again and again. Blow after blow, Falco threw into his own jaw, every other blow giving off a terrific crunching sound as the blood of his tongue and molars began to pour out his mouth. Montano only heard this. Montano knew what Falco was doing and admired his second's initiative to prevent his ability to speak. Montano knew that he'd do the same thing as well, but for the moment, he was too focused on the remaining jailer. Montano leaned on the bars, his bloody hands hanging through them, and Montano saw the eyebrows of his jailer raise as Falco continued his work. Montano continued to look at the trooper who was studying Falco's activity as a perplexed look grew on the jailer's face. He saw the name tag on the trooper's chest armor that said his name was Harton, and Montano briefly wondered why the trooper hadn't removed his name tag like he'd noticed all the other profligate soldiers had done. The only reason Montano and Falco knew the woman's name was because she'd been mentioned by the troopers outside, and although Harton was mentioned as well. He couldn't fathom why this man failed where everyone else in camp didn't with such a simple uniform directive. Montano chalked this up to the man's apparent idiocy, and just as Montano considered the idea that the NCR would actually enlist a soldier with such a mental disability in their army, he decided to see if this was true. "Why don't you stand up for yourself?" ordered Montano. Montano watched the trooper's head turn and twist to one of surprise as Montano was at last met with, "I don't really need to. You're the guys who got captured. I will slit your fucking throat and fuck your mother's corpse in front of that worthless sack of shit you call a father," thought Montano as the reality of the idiot's words sank into Montano's soul for the first time, no matter how badly Montano may have wanted to act on such a horrific threat. The moron's simple words only cemented the reality that Montano was virtually powerless for the first time ever. "You're the guys who got captured," echoed in Montano's mind again and again as the feeling of failure and how he failed grew. Another cracking sound came from Falco on his left as Montano continued to lock eyes with the jailer. Still battling to suppress the reality of what his capture truly meant, Montano could only reply unconsciously, "Fair enough." A brief silence ensued, and Montano was lost in thought when he was interrupted by the jailer. "Why's your pal hitting himself in the face?" Again, Montano was tempted to berate the trooper when the thoughts on his mind spilled out of his mouth to answer the question, "We didn't get a chance to kill ourselves before capture. He's making sure he won't be able to talk." Montano heard Falco's punches getting weaker before Montano again had his thoughts interrupted when he was asked, "Well, what about you? Looks like he's about tuckered out. Is it your turn next?" The centurion listened to punch after punch from his loyal second. All the thoughts, all the memories of so many glorious triumphs and battles won, flashed through his mind only to wind up imprisoned by the vilest of enemy armies and questioned by the stupidest amongst them. What troubled Montano most was that he was actually answering these questions. This thought occurred to him even as he found himself saying, "I'll do what I need to do when the time comes." At least these questions weren't important, but still, why he was answering them remained a mystery even to himself as his mind was still preoccupied. Just then, one final terrible cracking sound came from Montano's left, and he heard the body of Falco slump onto the floor. Montano was proud, but the idea of failure threatened to fully consume him until the jailer asked to the room, "Was I supposed to stop that?" Immediately after the words entered Montano's mind, he let out a snort or snicker. Montano caught this instantly, and the jailer's oblivious utterance ended the wave of failure about to drown him. Then all he'd seen since awaking in captivity began to make sense, and Montano once more found himself considering the very things that caused his rage and broken hands. This was the most pathetic army I have ever seen. They may have won the battle, and although I remain their captive, all I need to do is bide my time until their incompetence gets the better of them and I have the chance to die, and hopefully take a few of them with me. Montano thought all this, the waves of defeat subsiding with the knowledge that his victory is only delayed. As Montano collected more of his confidence, he began to feel the blood in his broken hands pumping straight to the site of the pain. For some reason, this physical pain was no longer unbearable. Thoughts of his future victory in death had numbed the pain, and Montano only hoped that the interrogation he'd receive would be as brutal as possible, leaving him even weaker and closer to death without a single word spilled before that death could be realized. Montano found himself staring at the jailer in the dead silence. Several moments passed and Montano came to the conclusion that he could at least get a head start on taking a few of them down with him. Although this idiot jailer would not participate in the verbal chaos, he would perhaps fall in a mental battle. Just as he came to this conclusion, the jailer had enough of the silence when he asked Montano casually, "So, where you guys from?" "I'm pretty sure Kaisar would let you answer that question." "Ha!" "Arizona," replied Montano flatly, more focused on how it would feel to decapitate this hardened fool than the question. Montano continued to think about this as his death plotting went on, and the trooper said amusingly, "No kidding. Never been there myself. Only left the coast a few months ago." "I think it was a few months ago at least." "Even though I won't be there, the Legion will reach the coast, and when it does, my replacement will happily butcher your family," thought Montano, as he let the non-question hang. The silence acted for itself, and the jailer was clearly becoming comfortable with Montano enough to ask, "So, what's Kaisar like? Ever meet him?" "Now's my moment to strike," thought Montano as he said, "I never had the honor to meet Lord Kaisar, but if you unlock the door, he'll forgive my capture when I slaughter you and everyone in this camp. Then, I can meet him." The jailer nodded as he said, "I'll have to take your word on that, but the door's staying shut." And Montano watched as the man's face slowly twisted to one of disappointment, rather than anger. Interested in this seeming affect, Montano waited patiently until the jailer asked in mild curiosity or partial frustration, "Why are you and your pals so crazy? It isn't like we're gonna crucify you." Montano wanted to laugh at this again, but the death and terror on his stern face never changed as he said simply, "You should." Hart, the jailer, apparently wanted to say something else by the look on his face, but after a brief moment, Montano was only asked, "Why?" "To see if it works." "I can tell you it won't though," Montano said unconsciously, mind blank, as he let the words from his Legion soul creep further up his vocal cords. "If, what will work?" asked the trooper curiously. Now was the time Montano thought he could achieve some minor victory from this short exchange of words, who may be foolish enough to spread the message of Legion terror. In his last act of dedication to his directive before being whisked away to his future interrogation and coming death, Montano began, "Why do you think we do what we do? Why do you think we leave your friends to die in the sun? Why do you think we rape your women, enslave your children, and butcher those under your protection? Montano concluded that the man was smarter than he thought if the brief moment of contemplation said anything, and the jailer's simple response of, "Why's that?" seemed to indicate that he was still foolish enough to spread the coming message. The thought of this caused his sinister smile to etch its way across his stone face before he sent the message. Because it works on you. Look at what we've done with our presence in Nelson alone. Every day you'll fight to survive, grow weaker and weaker, and see your nightmares each night become more and more real with every friend you watch get hauled up on a cross. You'll constantly know what is coming for you. Montano knew he'd fully captured the trooper's attention as he asked, "And why won't it work if we did that stuff to you?" "Because we want to be here," answered Montano, playing on the fool's search for knowledge. The jailer was clearly confused, so Montano elaborated for his simple new friend. "Look at your comrades. Look at yourself. You were drafted or blindly volunteered to help the profligates of this desert, only to watch all your friends die slowly and horribly." All the moments of his time in the South spreading the terror went through his mind again, and Montano was finally able to personally deliver the cause for this terror campaign to someone who'd actually walk away from an audience with himself. The soldier inquired about Montano being a slave to Caesar, and despite being briefly infuriated by being considered of such a pathetic position, he calmly explained that Lord Caesar had actually saved him. Montano's whole life passed before his eyes as he thought of all the ways he served Caesar, but his mind eventually cleared, and he found himself looking at this trooper who'd been curiously asking questions about what he had no idea was truly coming for him. The orders to the terror forces were vague, but everything he'd seen in this short captivity explained the reason for the terror and the Legion's reputation this side of the river. Now, here was the man who'd spread the reason for his presence in the profligate lands, and why he and his nation's morals are so misguided in a land that is just like the East, a land where the only remedy is Caesar. Montano told the man, "You want what you want. You are selfish, only loyal to yourself and those around you. You don't want to be in this desert. I only have one desire in life, and that is what Lord Caesar demands of me. Caesar wants the Mojave. I want the Mojave. You and your nation don't." Montano saw the truth of Caesar enter the jailer's mind and saw the brief glimmer of his misguided allegiance dash across his vision. However, before Montano could say anything more, the sergeant returned with a squad of guards, and Montano continued to lock eyes with the fool as he was bound and escorted out of jail, and Falco was put on a stretcher. Montano could only hope that the jailer would further spread the Legion's truth for him, and Montano was confident enough in this last victory that the camp's name would remain Forlorn Hope, and he could now focus solely on his ultimate victory in death. Aileron, Part 3. Veteran Decanus Falco awoke on a stretcher a few hours after he and his centurion's removal from the Camp Forlorn Hope jail. His jaw was almost completely busted, but the pain was non-existent. He assumed this was because the pain was so severe that he'd been completely numb to it, but was unaware that the NCR medics had actually injected him with another stim pack before he was ready to move out. He felt his body sweating profusely and believed himself to still be dreaming, but he could see the figure above him despite being too blinded by the sun above to make out exactly what it was at first. The figure adjusted itself, breathed heavily, and looked down at Falco's face, partially blocking the sun above and showing what it was. Falco didn't see anything other than that brown pan helmet and the disgruntled face beneath it before he instantly raised his hands to begin protests. The only problem was that Falco couldn't. His hands were shackled to the stretcher he occupied and couldn't raise his hands but 4 inches from where they currently were. Just then, the face looking down at him said, "Look who's awake." The figure looked up, blinding Falco to the sun again as the trooper spoke to someone ahead. "Hey, Martin. Looks like the mad lad came around." Falco only heard the trooper ahead called, "Martin," give out a "ha" before Falco immediately began struggling, trying to break free of his restraints. There, Falco found out his legs were shackled too, rendering all of his protests futile. This struggle was noticed by the trooper above, who only said, "We'll have enough of that out of you, boyo. Should be thanking me and Martin here for giving you a free ride." Your poor pal's been taking the shoelace express like the rest of us." Falco went to let out a spree of curses and shouts, but his mouth and jaw were too mangled to offer anything but a croaking groan. He tried to form some spit in his mouth for the face above him, but came to the same conclusion about that prospect's impossibility before he even attempted it. When he'd been rendered completely unable to protest either physically or verbally, the words of the trooper finally hit him, and Falco lifted his head in search of his pal. Just beyond the trooper called Martin, at the front of the stretcher, Falco could see several more stretchers in transport occupied by profligate troops as the whole caravan rounded a slight turn on a highway. Beyond them were 3 Brahmin full of supplies, with 3 armed troopers on each side of each beast. Then, just past the supplies was a concentration of what appeared to be 6 troopers encircling someone in the middle at the head of the column. It was hard to see past so many soldiers, but between a gap in the tight little formation, Falco saw his centurion hobbling along with his legs and hands bound. Montano was too far for Falco to get his attention, even if his jaw wasn't busted or his vocal cords hadn't been torn by so much screaming, so Falco again realized he was completely powerless. All Falco could do to keep from even trying his futile escape attempts or keep those thoughts of such an incredible failure from weighing on him was to look around. Falco couldn't stand the sight of the soldiers in brown around this caravan, so his attention went to every other direction as he surveyed his surroundings. There wasn't much but sand and rock to his right, but to his left and past a small collection of buildings he could see a larger building with a sign on top saying Repcon. Falco had no idea what that was, but when looking at the structure, his peripherals caught sight of that tower in the distance marking the city of Vegas. The highway straightened out, and although Falco was no longer able to see the entirety of the caravan, his eyes went to the distant suburbs marking the perimeter of outer Vegas. That was where Falco and his Primus were heading, straight to the profligate city, a city that actually took pride in its dissolute nature. He'd heard that they were actually heading to the profligate army base just outside the city called Camp McCarran, but the fantasies of him not being there for Vegas's sacking finally began to hit him even more. The thought was too much, and Falco couldn't bring himself to take in any more of the sights around him. Especially the sight of his Primus bound and marching towards the worst fate a servant of Caesar could receive: captivity. The ultimate way to fail Caesar. There was nothing for Falco to do but stare up at that blinding sun above and ignore the occasional words sent his way by the stretcher bearers. Falco had resigned himself to be the ultimate failure that he was, and his only solace was the fact that his centurion was there with him. Only a few minutes in this defeat had passed when his view of the sun was briefly obstructed after crossing under a bridge of sorts. Just as he came out the other side, he heard the trooper above him say, "What say you, Kaiser man? You smoke?" Falco ignored this and wouldn't have replied even if he was able to. The voice of Trooper Martin sounded up ahead. "Ah, come on, man, you know these Kaiser boys ain't allowed to smoke. I bet his centurion or whatever would kill him just for that stim pack we gave him." The trooper above said to Falco in amusement, "Don't you worry about your centurion no more, Mr. Bladeswinger. He can't get you for a measly stim while you're with PFC Martin and I. Plus, I'm sure your centurion's long dead back in no man's." Falco thought about Montano at the head of the caravan, knowing his centurion was still very much alive to their shared dismay, and the trooper above went on talking to Falco as if he were actually interested in his words. "That jaw of yours will be fixed up right as lack of rain in no time. Good thing too, because I know my Legion bud here is more of a chaw man than a smoker." Trooper Martin let out a laugh, and just as the trooper above was about to go on amusing his friend at Falco's expense, a series of shots rang out in every direction. Falco's heart stopped in surprise before he became instantly giddy at the idea of finally dying. The immediate shots made Falco's stretcher bearers halt in place as troopers from the rear came storming past them. Falco twisted his head in every direction looking for the attacker as he was gently set down by Trooper Martin and his comrade. Falco's gentle lowering was put to an immediate end, and the raiders were identified as not Legion when a laser beam came from the right and pierced Trooper Martin's neck, the blinding beam coming out the other side. The leg end of Falco's stretcher came down with a crash and bent one of the poles out of place as Trooper Martin fell to the asphalt, and the head end fell equally hard when Martin's friend went to see to him. More dirt and debris kicked up as more shots came from all directions, and the NCR troopers fanned out to fire into the wastes and nearby suburbs. There Falco laid, slightly concussed from the short drop of his stretcher, and the trooper responsible for him was out of sight, seen to his killed friend. All the while, Falco stared up at the sky as his view of it became slightly more obscured by the dust of battle. Moments into the chaos, Falco heard the voice of his surviving stretcher-bearer scream over the roar of gunfire to one of the rear guard troops. "I can't leave Martin like this." One of the rear guards screamed back, "We have to! Come on! Convoy's moving out of the kill zone!" More gunshots popped off, and laser beams shot across the landscape as Trooper Martin's friend asked, "What about the prisoner?" The rear guardsman shouted back, "Leave him for the fiends. We got the other one moving up, so come on." Falco propped his head up and watched the NCR forces of the caravan flee north towards the city as more shots pelted the toppled Brahmin and the soldiers fled away from the kill zone. Several of the stretchers were left abandoned there with him, and Falco assumed the ones taken were the ones carting their injured troops. As the rear guard scrambled north, returning fire when possible, Falco caught the last glimpse of his centurion still getting rushed away from the ambush site and grinned at his continuing protest before disappearing beyond the dust. There Falco lay, abandoned with the NCR's dead as the shots around him came to a close and the fiends approached the meager spoils of their partially successful raid. "I don't respect, admire, or even like the fiends, but I understand Caesar's use for them more and more," said Alaron to himself as he turned his eyes back to Falco kneeling before him. Alaron studied the broken and battered man for a long while in the immediate silence. Alaron pieced together a pretty clear picture of what happened with Decanus Falco and Centurion Montano. Despite it being tremendously difficult for Falco to relay the story with his broken jaw, Alaron couldn't help but admire the rapid results of old-world medicines and how their implementation would shave days or even weeks off normal legionary recovery times. Alaron knew the reason for this was because over-reliance on such remedies would only make the legion weaker with time. But Alaron briefly gave internal thanks to NCR for giving Falco the ability to relay his story. However, just to verify, Alaron reiterated what he took from the story of Falco. Alaron stated, "So, after the fiends picked through the wreckage of their attack, and after the NCR withdrew from the region with Centurion Montano, the fiends left you alone believing you to be dead in your concussed state. Sometime after they departed, you managed to free your legs due to the damaged stretcher poles. You then walked south through the open wastes, evading regional traffic, NCR patrols, and found yourself at the gates of Cottonwood Cove approximately 3 days later. Surviving the heat and living off the land, you were taken to the feet of Centurion Aurelius of Phoenix, who admired your determination to relay Montano's death and approved your request to be crucified for failure under the condition that you fulfill the last request of Centurion Montano by reporting his fate to me." Alaron paused, and the Decanus nodded with his head hung low. Alaron finally said, "I only have one question." Falco raised his head slightly, and Alaron asked him, "Why did you tell Aurelius that Montano was killed when you told me that he was captured? Why did you lie to a Centurion of the Legion?" Falco looked up, and after a brief hesitation managed to say, "I am certain of Montano's death by this point. I only left out the details regarding his capture because I have such respect for him." Again, it took Falco a while to speak since his jaw was still recovering, and Alaron had to have certain words reiterated on occasion. Still, when Alaron heard everything he had to, Falco saw the question on Alaron's mind and went to answer it before it was asked. "I only told Centurion Alaron the truth because I knew Centurion Montano, regardless of his feud with you, was not afraid of telling his rival any truth." Alaron let those words linger for a while as he looked at the broken state of the deliverer and wondered about whether or not Montano truly was alive at this point. Alaron himself had every reason to believe that Montano found the time to do what he needed to do in captivity, but still, there was something else. Even the idea of Montano getting himself captured in the first place was something that continued to leave Alaron feeling somewhat vacant. Alaron remained silently contemplating all of this, the weight of his rival's fate striking him a bit harder than he thought, and though he was inclined to grin at Montano's desire for Alaron to hear his true fate, the matter was still one that only left him thinking. At last, Falco looked up a bit more to the eyes of Alaron, expecting Alaron's face to show amusement in the failure of his Primus, but was surprised to see Montano's rival still stuck in deep contemplation. Falco remained ready to defend the honor of Montano despite his shackled and battered state, But the more he looked at Alaron, the more he knew that he wouldn't have to do that. Finally, Falco managed to say to Alaron, "I must also inform Centurion Alaron of my final message before my death. Centurion Montano intended to give to you everything that was in his possession, every title, every slave, every property, should he die." Even hearing that Montano left everything he had to his sworn enemy did little to change the demeanor of Alaron, still stuck in thought. As odd as Alaron thought it was that he too left everything he had to Montano should he die, this idea could not change what Alaron was considering, even as Falco added. Centurion Aurelius was aware of this as well, so expect a runner with the remainder of my Centurion's belongings with the accompanying certifications in the coming days. Could it really be? Thought Centurion Alaron. Alaron had dreamt of Montano's death for so many years, spent days planning it in his mind, and even attempted it on so many occasions throughout the years. So much planning, so much preparation, so many battles, so many wars, and so much time passed only for Alaron's sworn enemy to die in the aftermath of one battle that wouldn't even be recorded in the Legion's history? Montano, after all he'd done, was finally gone, and although he was likely dead by this point, Montano was actually taken captive as well. Alaron would have certainly used such a fate against him if they were to ever face each other again before a bout of mutual combat, but Montano was gone now. Dead or captive didn't matter. Alaron knew that he would never see his rival again, and would never have the chance to be the one who personally escorted him into the grave. All of this left Alaron feeling more empty than he'd been in his whole life. Alaron would receive the items left to him, but the idea of receiving these inanimate objects or titles for slaves and lands so many miles away only carved the feeling of Alaron's emptiness even further into his being. After so long in this silence, after hearing the news and battling the emptiness of the new world without his rival, Alaron heard from the bound man before him. "Centurion Alaron, I have done all that was left for me in service to Caesar. I am yours to end for my failure by capture, and am ready for the cross." Ever so slowly, Alaron was pulled from his thoughts as the present came back and the words entered his brain one by one. Alaron finally looked up from his lap, his mind clear as the weight of Montano's fate hung dangerously in the background, until he looked upon the hanging head of Deaconus Falco. At any other time in his life, Alaron would have looked at a legionary who'd been captured and knelt before him with dripping disgust and disdain. Alaron would have personally hammered in the nails like he'd done to so many slaves and profligates over the decades, but Alaron looked at the chained Deaconus in a way that was completely foreign to his prior determinations. Alaron saw the defeated and hanging head of Falco, and the thoughts of acting on Falco's request for death were nestled in the furthest parts of his mind. When Alaron looked at Falco, he was not looking at a legionary who got captured. He wasn't even looking at a legionary who escaped captivity without spilling a word. Alaron was looking at an exceptionally devout and loyal officer of the Legion, an officer who did not get captured, but merely stuck by the commander he so loved, even if it meant failure to Caesar. Whether that was because of coincidence, unfortunate circumstances, or fate was irrelevant. Falco loved his commander so much that he craved his own death, but not before he could carry out the final demands of that commander, when his situation left him free from captivity. Deaconus Falco felt the eyes of Centurion Alaron as he awaited the determination in that deafening silence. No words came, but still, those eyes remained on Falco's person until the kneeling man, at last, looked up to meet the eyes of his Centurion's sworn enemy. When Alaron saw the eyes of Falco sitting above that broken and distorted mouth, he could not see Falco. Centurion Alaron could only see the last remaining vestige of a man he dedicated years of Legion service towards besting. Alaron's life flashed before his eyes. Everything he'd done since meeting Montano in that sleepy Arizona town between waging war on the Ajoans, serving the Interfector, running Circle Junction, fighting at Dogtown, pushing the Legion towards even more victories, and then helping pick the Legion back up after the humiliation at the dam. All of it flashed before his eyes. He heard the words of Montano accuse him of disloyalty to Caesar on that first morning, and saw the determined eyes of Montano as Alaron was carried back across the dam. Then, he saw the face of that man hovering over him the night after Graham's death, as his own words from that evening went through his mind again. Do it, Montano. Montano was to win that night, and Alaron was to die. It should have been me, thought Alaron. Alaron should not have lived past that night, and although his end may not have prevented the ultimate fate of Montano, Alaron knew that if there was anyone in the room this evening who was destined for a cross, it wasn't Falco, it was himself. Alaron knew that he'd been living on borrowed time since the night Montano won their last fight, but then Alaron remembered another person who was living on borrowed time. Alaron remembered that man so well, and more importantly, how highly his Lord Interfector looked up to him. A long time had passed since that day he overheard his elite speak to the old legate. And there, Alaron remembered the elite, and what a wildly devoted yet tragic man he was. Alaron thought back to the first day he met the Lord Interfector and what he did. Alaron saw himself standing between two legionaries chained to two posts. The one on the left was his younger self, and the one on his right was Montano wearing the rags that Falco currently wore. The chained Alaron looked into the eyes of his rival on the other post, both with their backs ready to be opened as the centurion of today and so many years past stood between them. So many years of such exceptional servitude was given to both Alaron and Montano that day when they were extended a mercy that neither of them wanted. That mercy extended to Alaron and Montano ignited the engine that drove both men to so much success and triumph by their inability to be put back in their incognito positions within the Legion's ranks after that day. Alaron continued to think about that first act of kindness from a fish out of water, like the Lord Interfector was, and continued to be throughout his own years of exceptional servitude for a master he couldn't love but followed anyway out of duty. Both duelists knew that they owed the Lord Interfector so much for that simple act, as the two would forever be remembered for standing out from the masses of legionaries from that point forward, and never look back when they remembered the look in the other's eyes before their next moment of glory. There, Alaron broke from his dreaming thoughts and looked into the eyes of Falco, seeing the same man that was chained to the post outside Gold Canyon back in 2262. Alaron saw the same fire in Falco that the Interfector saw in himself and Montano that day, and knew Decanus Falco's story was not nearly over. Alaron at last said very calmly to Decanus Falco, "No, stand up." Alaron could see the panic in Falco's eyes at being spared from what he felt he was due, but Alaron put a halt to any protest before it could start, as he told Falco the words that weren't Alaron's own. "This matter is over. You might have been wrong in some form or another, but that doesn't mean your damned hands should be nailed to a cross. You screwed up? Fine. I don't care. Just don't let this shit happen again. I hope you learned something. Mercy isn't such a bad thing if you can help it." Weeks later, mid-2281, Alaron's sparing of Decanus Falco went unnoticed by pretty much every other centurion or commander in the lakeside encampment, and he'd been ignored entirely by Lord Caesar and the elites of the fort's interior for so long that nobody even took notice of his new slave. Some of Alaron's peers at the lakeside encampment occasionally asked in passing why his new slave was a man of military age and fitness, but their inquiries were usually brushed off when Alaron said the new slave owed him. No further explanation was needed after that, especially since Alaron was the fort's top administrator who had more important things to do than explain the backstory of his new peon. Of course, Falco protested his sparing that first night, but was very forthrightly reminded by Centurion Alaron that Falco was not to question the orders of a centurion, as the words of a centurion were the words of Caesar, wherever the emperor wasn't. Falco continued to feel like the failure he was, but regardless of his internal dismay, he carried out the orders of his new centurion without question or protest. And so Falco strictly adhered to Alaron's orders to not take his own life despite the lingering mental pain of having been captured. Falco's jaw was fully healed shortly after that night, and he tried to take as much humiliation as he could in the demotion to slave. Becoming a slave was certainly not the crucifixion he wanted, but it did well in giving him the feeling of justice he craved for his failure to Caesar. Falco would carry out each of Centurion Alaron's menial directives, and often worked alongside Gabriella. Bearing the brunt of the abuse on errands around the camp from his former brothers in rank and arms, Falco never revealed who he used to be, but always identified himself as the property of Centurion Alaron Before he had the satisfaction of a beating brought about by one of his ex-brothers, he failed. Aileron himself continued to be plagued with the empty void left by Montano's fate, and although time seemed to help, the thought was still there hovering in the background while Aileron filled his days with menial work for the fort's operations. It should be mentioned that Aileron was only keeping Falco a slave just as a temporary means of punishment, while he figured out how to properly utilize him. He considered raising him back to his prior rank and having him set off to oversee Montano's old lands and slaves now left to Aileron. But he decided to hold off on that as he was pulled this way, and that regarding matters of the fort. So, Falco would remain a slave in the meantime, if only so Aileron could keep a stricter eye on him and allow him to serve in a better way. Now, Aileron obviously knew how skilled of a fighter Falco was, and being the second to a man like Montano meant that he was a very dangerous kind of slave. Of course, Aileron knew that Falco would bear any kind of abuse since the former Decana saw the enslavement as the punishment it was. Aileron's only fear regarding the new slave in the meantime was that Falco would become so deteriorated by slavery that he would screw up his next shot at redeeming himself, whenever or whatever that may be. Either way, Aileron was hesitant to send Falco into the arena, but the fear of him becoming complacent eventually outweighed his fear of Falco using a chance in the arena to achieve his overdue death. So, after a few weeks in slavery, Aileron had Falco fight in the fort's arena under the strict orders that death was not an option. With the complacency worry being dealt with by arena fights, Aileron had a secondary objective to fulfill with Falco's time in the arena as well. This secondary objective was one that Aileron was working on while Falco took part in the series of fights. Falco entered the fort's arena under the name Falcon, and although that wasn't the cleverest of names, it was enough to prevent any parallels with any legionaries who may have heard about the death of Montano and his staff in an attack on Camp Forlorn Hope. After all, if anyone back at Nelson managed to see two of their own get captured in the night of Montano's fate, there was no way of knowing exactly which two legionaries they were through the smoke of battle, distance, and darkness of that night. The only one who may have been able to connect the two people was Centurion Aurelius, but he'd been assigned to oversee Cottonwood Cove, likely until the next battle at the dam. And the chances of Aileron stumbling across him with Falco by his side were not going to happen in the foreseeable future. So, the only strangeness that came from Falco's time in the arena was the curiosity that was usually stirred when Falco entered the cage and expertly slaughtered the other slaves who tried their hands at freedom. Despite Aileron's misgivings about having Falco kill a few recruits in that series of fights, he figured that Falco was merely trimming the fat that would have died in the opening machine gun fire of the first wave against Hoover Dam. So, the days passed slowly by, and nothing changed for Aileron regarding his station. The days did go slower than usual for him, since the placement of Falco at his side managed to bring the continuing weight of Montano's end, that he still battled to keep in the background of his mind. Even when this plagued him, Aileron kept focused on his work for the fort, regardless of how unworthy it may be during this endless stage of idleness in the Mojave War. It wasn't until the end of July 2281 that many of the thoughts he'd been trying to ignore caught up to him, and everything he went through since the end of Graham forced Aileron's consideration about who he was exactly. Late July 2281, Aileron sat at his command desk within his command domicile, glancing out the window he had Gabriella create. The lake was really pretty from that little hill his tent occupied, and he sincerely considered going for a swim since the heat of the Mojave was horrid despite Gabriella still dutifully fanning him. He eventually glanced back at her from the window and gestured with his hand that he'd had enough and was permitting her to fan herself. Gabriella started fanning herself after graciously thanking Aileron for his kindness, something that was met with no response as his mind remained elsewhere. She considered asking about Aileron's internal state, and Aileron felt this unspoken question as well, but refused to address it. The Centurion didn't know that he would miss veteran Decanus Serranus, but this little transfer of Aileron was one that he felt compelled to do given Falco's series of victories in the arena. Today was the day, and Aileron's only regret was that the situation with the Ranger slave would have occurred to him earlier. Aileron thought that it would have been excellent for Falco to earn his way out of slavery by finally dealing with that Stella slave, but unfortunately, the idea occurred to him too late, and Otho already told Alaron that Falcon had won enough fights to earn the ability to serve. Alaron settled this minor frustration by reminding himself that Stella would fall to some other reputable legionary or individual another day. So, Alaron had just returned to his domicile after hearing from Otho about Falcon's final victory and immediately dismissed his old senior. Decanus Soranus, who left to oversee Montano's entrusted lands not more than 5 minutes prior to the current moment. There, Alaron waited for Falco/Falcon to return to his command domicile and report his success. Alaron briefly wondered how Falco would handle the reinstatement back to his old rank, but remembered that a legionary, ex-legionary or otherwise, was impossible to read beyond the telepathic level. Alaron reflected on the past weeks and how Falco had carried out all of his slave duties excellently, even taking several beatings from other legionaries without protest, until he could relay who his master was to the amused aggressors. As excellent as Falco was as a slave, Alaron was able to read the man's subconscious mind the whole time, which still emanated a supreme self-loathing. It was true that this feeling became less and less over the days, and it was almost non-existent when he was being humiliated. But it was still there, and Alaron wondered if his plans for the man would increase or decrease that radiating feeling. Either way, Falco was likely still getting himself cleaned up as Alaron sat there, and the Centurion knew the man had a few other errands to see to before checking back in. So, Alaron motioned for Gabriella to split her use of the fan between himself and herself as Alaron resumed his current duties in waiting. Opening up the stack of folders on his left, he briefly read the report and noted the progress on the excavation of those intake tunnels. He wished that there was more progress than he read, but it appeared that the blockage was far, far worse than originally expected when it was discovered months earlier, and the excavation was still going steadily enough, provided Kaisar didn't plan on using them tomorrow. When Alaron read all he needed to, he pressed his stamp on the first page and tossed the folder onto the stack on his right. 9 more to go now. I can only hope to Mars that the rest of these require more work, thought Alaron, as he placed the next folder in his to-do stack in front of him. Just then, he heard the flap to his tent open, and Alaron looked up and didn't see Falco who he expected. Instead, Alaron saw his Vexillarius enter the enclosure, step before him, hail the room, and Alaron immediately looked back at his folder as he asked, "What do you have for me, Decius?" Alaron looked up as the Vexillarius placed 2 more folders on his desk and heard the standard bearer say, "2 more for you, my Centurion." Alaron ignored the reports, briefly studying the flag carrier before asking, "Anything more? I trust that you scanned through the reports as I instructed." "Yes, Centurion," said the Vexillarius militarily before adding, "Both directive reports require your address." As the Vexillarius spoke, Alaron had already opened the 2 folders and spread them out. A brief glimpse at the top one showed a priority indicator, but Alaron was left bewildered by the other one. After giving it a once-over, Alaron looked up at the Vexillarius and asked him, "Perhaps my excellent Vexillarius can enlighten me about the importance of this second one." "My Primus," said the officer before Alaron interrupted with another read into the second report. "How exactly is it my duty to address the issues of the midget slave Brahmin tender of the Fortification Hill interior?" Decius the Vexillarius answered his centurion's inquiry, "My Centurion is the overseer of all matters regarding the operations of Fortification Hill." Alaron remained staring at his subordinate menacingly, his eyes alone ordering the flag bearer to elaborate. From what I understood upon receiving the report, veteran Decanus Antony, master of hounds for this front, does not wish to overstep his position regarding my Primus, and only wishes for your approval to keep the contraband he acquired from the young slave girl under your jurisdiction. Alaron looked back down at the report, read it a little more, and wondered how it was possible for Antony to draft up an entire report about a teddy bear he confiscated from one of Alaron's Fortification Hill operational supply slaves, a young slave girl called Melody. Alaron was half tempted to have Antony brought before him in chains and have him thrown in the pen for wasting Alaron's time. Basically, Antony was asking permission from Alaron to keep the confiscated toy bear because his hounds were enjoying the thing, and was asking for assurance that Antony did not overstep his bounds by reprimanding and punishing a slave that wasn't under his jurisdiction. Alaron didn't believe that any such report was ever drafted in the entire history of the Legion. Most legionaries treated slaves however they wanted and enacted punishment as they saw fit on the spot, with the only preventative measures for slave treatment being the slave's ability to relay the name of their master and current directive to any possible aggressors within a Legion camp. In the end, Alaron already wasted too much mental energy on this dilemma. The only thing about this degrading report that Alaron considered was the idea how Alaron must have been doing such a great job in his station that Antony would even feel the need to draft a report about possibly overstepping his bounds, even in such a minuscule way. For the briefest moment, Alaron considered actually reading through and putting legitimate effort in addressing the key notes of the report, if only for a new way to keep busy in the idleness. Then, Alaron caught a glimpse of the stack on his left and the new priority report, and knew he had plenty more important things to do than put effort into a dilemma requiring no more than 2 seconds to solve. Decius saw the conclusion his centurion arrived at, and Alaron turned up to his vexillarius when he heard the soldier ask, "Shall I inform Antony that he acted in the right and did not overstep his bounds, my Primus?" Alaron silently stared at him for 6 seconds before concluding the whole ordeal. Yes. He was going to say that Decius should have said that before accepting the report for such a worthless waste of time, but he saw the look on Decius's face and knew the message was received, and such a thing would not happen again. Alaron handed the report about the toy and hound master back to Decius and was going to shoo him off before he caught another glimpse of the report marked as a priority. Alaron motioned for the man to stay put and looked back down at the remaining report. Alaron skimmed the overview and let out an audible and curious, "Huh," before asking the deliverer, "Who gave you this one?" "Just a runner from the interior who appeared to have just come from there and knew you were my Primus," said the vexillarius. Alaron continued reading the report, and just the overview page alone stuck out to him. "Lord Caesar's mechanical mongrel has been found? I didn't even know he went missing," said Alaron, leaving his vexillarius wondering whether or not a response was necessary. The centurion continued reading as he thought to himself, "Gifted to Lord Caesar by Lord Interfector of Phoenix after successful combat trial in the siege of Denver. Fought in the Battle of Colorado Wilderness, Brotherhood Campaign, lost in battle during the Auxilia Campaign, June of 2276, Northwest Arizona. Last seen near Garrison at Dry Wells, December of that year. Believed to be living with a dissolute gang leader in Vegas region, city of Freeside." Alaron flipped through the report showing pictures and sketches of the mechanical hound with notes to the identification marks, and then skimmed the following documents that elaborated on the hound's short but illustrious service to Caesar. Alaron briefly thought back to that hound and how he was the one who found it. Alaron remembered the place in Denver he acquired it. Then how well it performed in Montano's combat trial before handing it off to Lord Interfector to be given to the Emperor as a trophy from Denver. As interesting as it was, Alaron's recollection of Caesar's notable pet was cut short when the point of the report hit him. That being, there wasn't one. Alaron looked up and asked the vexillarius, "What am I supposed to do with this? I'm in charge of matters of the fort's operation." Decius snapped from his idle trance in an instant and replied, "The runner did not relay a summary of the report and objective. He only said that my centurion's input was required for a suggestion on further action." Just as Decius was done, Alaron was going to ask who specifically gave him the report, but instead flipped to the overview page and noticed a lack of any directives he was to act upon as the report's recipient. It was on that page, however, that Alaron just noticed the report was from Lucius himself, but even knowing that still left Alaron confused about what he was to do with this. Then the last sentence from Decius ran through his mind again, and he tossed the closed report back on his desk as he said generally, I suppose I can see if there are any frumentarii in the region who can investigate further." Alaron thought some more before adding, "Maybe I can dispatch a trader or contractor to the city or—" "An excellent idea, my centurion," said Decius. Alaron ignored the praise, and with his frustration beginning to grow at such strange new responsibilities, looked to the vexillarius and said, "Ask around the fort for any frumentarii who may be able to act on this report. Tell them the instruction is from Lucius so they'll actually listen to you." Decius was about to affirm the order and set off when Alaron gestured for him to leave as he added, "And if you happen across Lucius or one of his runners you know, tell him I'd like to inquire about my directive regarding the hound further." The Vexillarius acknowledged the command and set off. When the flap to his tent completely closed once more, Alaron turned back to his stack of to-do reports. But as soon as he did, the tent flap opened again. Alaron was about to lose it when in came Falcon/Falco. The slave entered and hailed Caesar as he knelt before the desk, and Alaron didn't mind this interruption. Alaron stood, and a hint of invisible pride washed over him as he moved around the desk to stand before the kneeling Falco still partially spattered in the blood of the arena. After Alaron returned his hail, he motioned for Falco to raise his head, and the man did so, meeting the eyes of Alaron, who gave the unspoken permission to speak. Falco stated, "Master, I have slain my adversaries in the arena and completed the remainder of my tasks before kneeling before you now. I am told by the arena master, Otho, that my master has new words for me regarding my victory." "I do," said Alaron as he stepped over to his cot and lifted the blade that was leaning against it before stepping back over to his place before Falco. Gabriella watched Alaron hold the blade in both his hands and saw her newest servant raise his head once more when Alaron was back in his place. Alaron said simply, "Slave, from this point forward, you are to be raised back to your prior rank of veteran Decanus. Due to your remarkable series of victories in the Fortification Hill arena, I have determined that you are absolved of your prior failures and require your placement in my staff. I trust that from your new position, you will only bring the Legion and myself more glory." Falco watched the blade get lowered towards him and was given the cue to accept it. Feeling the weight of the iron weapon in both hands, Falco did feel a sense of pride that completely erased his prior sensation of failure, even if it was only for a few moments. Falco would continue to struggle with the mercy extended to him, but Alaron knew this, having been there himself. Alaron thought back to the days after he and Montano's punishment when the Ajoans were destroyed, and how he too struggled with the raise to the Interfector staff, and knew what Falco was unable to understand in the current moment. More time, more battles, more victories, and more glory will erase any failure. Falco continued to hold the blade before him as he knelt there in the current moment, grappling with the idea of his centurion's word versus the word of Caesar, who spoke on whose behalf in which setting, and how that lone contradiction paved the way for a road of glory that Alaron and Montano both tread throughout the years. When all was done, Alaron ordered Falco to rise, saying that Falco was to be addressed as his new name for the time being, and that he was to wear his face covering at any time he was outside his centurion's domicile. Then Alaron raised his arm and pointed towards the chest in the corner of the tent, adding the final directive that Falco was to dress in the apparel befitting his new old rank and not look back. As Falco got out of his slave rags and adorned himself in the armor of a veteran Decanus, Alaron returned to his desk and back to the stack of reports. Alaron was very thankful for the short break from this menial work, but the feeling of dreadful idleness returned to him not long later. Sorting through supply lists and fortress inventories, Alaron read that Dale Barton was at the fort again, and looked to Falco as he considered having the new staff officer bring in that man for inquiry. Moments later, Falco had finished strapping on the last of his armor, pushing the left shin plate into position before rising and approaching Alaron's desk for instruction. When the new officer stood before Alaron, the centurion reclined back in his chair, feeling the sensation of new pride and lingering self-loathing wage its war in the air around that Decanus statue. At last, Alaron looked up at the crimson and steel-clad devil, knowing the first order he'd give the man would be small, but would also be a step in the new direction of his service under Centurion Alaron. "The traitor, Dale Barton, is at the fort. Find him and ask if his return to the fort comes with the howitzer firing mechanism I required him to retrieve from Yuma before his last departure. You are to inform him that I have waited long enough and saw him depart too many times for him to still be empty-handed regarding this matter. If the traitor is without the desired part, or if he has not even been to Yuma in the past months, you are to bind him in chains and bring him before me for punishment," Alaron thought. It was a simple order, but one that just needed to be done. Just as Alaron finished mentally crafting the order, he went to relay it to the new staff officer, but he was interrupted. Alaron's attention turned to the tent flap, unable to see who was entering with the blinding light. Figuring it to be another interruption for some other worthless report that apparently required his attention, Alaron's frustration was instantly ended when he saw it was Lucius who had entered. Taken by the arrival of Lucius and two other Praetorians, Falco remained like a statue facing his Primus before Alaron caught the stern look on Lucius's face as he approached Alaron's desk. Alaron had never seen Lucius wearing an expression like that and was even more puzzled when Lucius stepped up and ordered to the room. "Everyone but Centurion Alaron, leave now." Alaron nodded at Falco, who still hadn't seen the arrival for focus on his Centurion, but the nod from his Primus immediately made Falco about face and leave with Gabriella. Alaron remained puzzled as Lucius stared at him, and the two Praetorians flanked the desk. The room was silent, and Alaron found the silence worrying as he stared into the face of the man he reported to. Alaron heard the heavy tent flap swing to a close, taking the footsteps of Gabriella and Falco with it. And Alaron was momentarily terrified that the look on Lucius's face came from knowledge about who exactly Alaron decided to spare and then promote. As this fear entered his brain, Alaron remained upright and full of conviction, ready to defend his decisions as well as accept the consequences of what they may entail. All of this worry and resolution in Alaron's mind came to a screeching halt when Lucius said to Alaron, "Draft me a list of every doctor you've ever met or heard about during your time with the Lord Interfector. I need the list of every town from here to Roswell left standing after the Eastern Harvest campaign. I already had a radio message sent to the current Praetor of Circle Junction for the same information, but your time under the Interfector will fill any possible gaps in what the Praetor will return with." Although Alaron was relieved this meeting wasn't about Falco, the tone and message of the Praetorian's delivery kept that worry there. Alaron listened intently as Lucius went on. "I also require the names of every independent trader who frequents this front with medical expertise and surgical ability, as well as the names of any such trader who's gone west throughout the Terror so the Frumentarii can track them down. To assist you in this, I am dispatching 4 Frumentari agents to your direct charge that you will utilize for scouting local vaults and ancient army depots. These agents will know what to look for." Just then, Lucius withdrew another folder marked with a priority indicator and placed it on Alaron's desk. Lucius then motioned for Alaron to take a look at it, and Alaron did so, still wondering what this was about, and wondering even more why the directive report only had 2 pages. Skimming the first page, there was no explanation of the directives, but the list of directives highlighted everything Lucius just said, with the addition of several ancient medications that were not considered contraband anymore. The second page only had an old photograph of a mechanical instrument with several arms sticking out of it at the base of a console. The heading above the picture said that the thing was called an autodoc, with various notes pointing to parts of the cross-section. As Alaron's eyes lingered on the page with the photo, Lucius added, "The Frumentari I've given you will be looking for these autodocs, but you ought to issue them the location of these vaults and military bases when I've cross-referenced your intel with that of Circle Junction. While you compile the information, I still need the list of our traders and doctors in both the East and West. Get it done, Centurion Alaron." Lucius turned to depart but halted when he saw Alaron's eyes still lingering on the pages with that confused expression. Alaron noticed that Lucius was still standing there and looked up, realizing that he'd forgotten to acknowledge the order. "Yes, Praetorian, I will see this done." Thinking that's what Lucius was waiting for, Alaron watched Lucius remain in place. Moments passed and the two continued to lock eyes, and Lucius showed no signs of his impending departure. Alaron studied the tremendous worry and urgency on the face of Lucius, and several more moments passed in the silence. Although Lucius had no doubt that Alaron would accomplish the new directive, and even though he did not owe Alaron an explanation, the silence ended when both men were brought back to the present, and Lucius said to Alaron, "Lord Caesar is sick. He remains fine at the moment, but he himself believes his demise is approaching." Alaron's face never changed, but the news hit Alaron's mind with a tsunami of dread. Alaron could only ask, "How long?" Another momentary silence ensued as both men thought and battled the horrible news. Lucius finally said, "Only weeks, perhaps. or maybe months if our emperor is correct in his assessment, but his affliction is slowly getting worse. Alaron replied immediately, I'll see this done before anything else. Lucius gave Alaron a small nod, his face still plagued with dread as he said, I know you will. He turned to depart when he stopped himself for the final time and said to Alaron, You will not tell anyone what I have told you. The Frumentarii I've dispatched to your charge already know, but discussion of this will never take place. Not your servant, not your staff, nobody is to know the nature of your orders regarding this matter. Alaron said, Understood, Praetorian, and the tent flap swung to a close as the Praetorians left. Being left with such terrible news, Alaron immediately began collecting and drafting his necessary lists. The urgency of the matter saying that Alaron would have to inquire Lucius about the mechanical hound at some other time.